Today on the Servant Leadership Podcast, we welcome Bill High. Bill's journey took him from poverty to becoming a partner in a major law firm, to guiding some of the most influential families in the world on how to build a legacy. Through his work with high net worth families at Legacy Stone and co-authoring books with Hobby Lobby founder David Green, Bill has helped leaders see that the greatest measure of success isn't net worth. It's how well you prepare your family to thrive for generations. Join us as Bill shares why family vision, mission, and values are the foundation for a generational mindset, and why true legacy is about what you set in motion, not just what you leave behind.
Bill, thank you so much for being on the Servant Leadership Podcast.
And I'm glad to be here, Chris. Heard a lot about you and finally here.
This is so exciting. You've had a very unique vantage point over the years and a unique story to get here, but you come alongside families and help them think about wealth differently. How did you get into this, and what does this actually look like?
Yeah, it is a crazy story, Chris, because I got to back up a little bit because I grew up extremely poor. So here I am, a kid growing up, welfare kind of family, and here I am now being able to consult and work with families all across the country, sometimes around the globe with great wealth. So God's sense of humor, I think. But I grew up, as I say, poor, but by the grace of God was able to go to law school, practice law with a big law firm. 12 years there, to become a partner. It was a great gig, but it wasn't my end game, and always felt like I was called to be able to go out and to serve people in a broader way. So I helped start a foundation that was tied to the National Christian Foundation. We began serving families, helping them in their charitable giving, a lot of charitable tax planning. So that was my doorway in.
Wow. So that's a big jump to go from partner at a law firm. That's kind of what most people achieve, and then they're set. You know, there was something nagging on you, though, that kind of took you in a different direction. Why make that jump?
It was kind of crazy because we had 4 kids at the time. I was a partner in a law firm, had my best year ever, had one of the biggest and best clients in the firm. And this was no small firm. And when I left, we had 330 lawyers. Yeah. So it was a huge firm for the country at that point in time. But I always felt like that my call was to take care, tend the flock of God. That's my charge. And so for me, it was a great way. But it was a startup. So I left the law firm and literally had my car, a cell phone, a legal pad, had to go create incorporation documents, the whole bit, and then go start knocking on doors, start talking to people about their charitable giving and how to give away money. How about that for a great startup?
So sometimes that's an awkward conversation to talk to somebody about parting with what matters most to them. What was it like when you got into this world, and why did that even interest you?
You know, we felt like that we could change a city and change a country if we could get people to think differently. But the way we started those conversations, it wasn't like a big sales job. It was really just like this. It was, tell me about your story. Tell me who you are, what you care about. And we just listened and listened really hard for what people's interests and passions were, and found out how we could connect with those and to serve them at their point of need. So over about 20 some years, it was about $6 billion that came into the foundation. We had clients in 48 states. We were really working hard on Hawaii for obvious reasons. But anyway, 48 states, and I forget how many different cities. So it was a wild run. But while we were doing that, we did have some families come to us, one of which we've talked a little bit about, the Hobby Lobby family. And people were asking this question, hey, the charitable giving is good, the estate planning is good, but we need more help with our family. And that was when one of those light bulb moments went on for me. It's like, we're helping people with some of these maybe you'd think generosity is a big thing, but we're helping them in some cases with very transactional issues. But this core issue of family and helping the family succeed from generation to generation, we were missing it.
So on this podcast, we've had some interesting, notable families who are in third generation business. And one of the things that comes up is that by the third generation, a lot of businesses are failing, especially when you talk through companies and families that have multi-billion-dollar net worth. I know it's not just like secret sauce. There's like actually process that goes into this and really hard work. Talk about how you help people think through building something that lasts.
Yeah, the proverb is true, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, and that's a proverb that's repeated around the world. So Australia has a proverb, and theirs is from goon to grange to goon. Bad wine to good wine, back to bad wine. Italy is from stalls to stars to stalls. So it is a truism that's repeated around the world, is that your family will not carry on its family values from one generation to the next. And it's really important for the listeners here that they understand this, that it's not just the family business, but it's the family. Your kids and your grandkids are not likely to remember all your stories, all of your values. And there's nothing that grieves you more than that. So ultimately, just in going down that road, we saw that, and we saw that there was actually, and the doorway that I went in initially is there's been a lot of research that's been done. So from a historical and a sociological perspective, we know why a family can succeed from one generation to the next. I come from a background of faith, so I believe in the Bible, and the Bible speaks very clearly about generational success, and that's the goal. I mean, why would anybody go start out and think, I'm going to have kids and I'd sure like to ruin them, you know? Do you know anybody that's come on this podcast and said, that's my aim? Of course not.
So with this, I mean, what is the first steps? Because one of the things that you said just there, which is different, is my question was a little bit more about how do you handle all the wealth? And you talked about and brought up the value side of it. I don't think that comes naturally for people to even think about family values. I don't hear that as common language. What does that process look like to start making that common language within a family?
So the first thing is it's actually a worldview that you have to adopt. So I'd call it family worldview. If you want to put it in the biblical context, you have to recognize there's a theological context is another way to say it. But you have to recognize what's the purpose of family. And here in the U.S., we have a very, very Western view of family. So this is first step. The first step is to recognize is that the goal is not to raise your kids in this protective little nest, and then at 18 you kick them out and say, go do your own thing. That's what you'd call the raise them up and kick them out theory so I can retire and play golf. That is a highly individualistic approach, which is the needs and wants of the individual are greater than the collective. So that's the Western view. But from a historical, sociological view, from a biblical view, the view really is that family is a collective. Family's a team. Every family starts on the farm, and so the farm is the economy, it is the socialization, it's the school, it's the church. So we all start out in this collective, and that means we need one another. We work together. And so if you start with that right worldview, that, hey, we are meant to be a team, then you don't end up with all this disparate collection of things. The idea of spread your wings and fly is actually really built around a Chinese proverb that you need to give your children roots and wings and not just say, go off and fly. What's a kite without a string?
So it sounds good, but it's not an easy process to do what you're talking about. I see families that try really hard to pass on values and work ethic and various things to the next generation. And from the outside, you look and it's just all falling apart. You know, what guidance do you give people, listeners especially, where it's something that they can take away and think through? Here's how I should be thinking about this for my family.
Yeah, so it really boils down to a few things. James Hughes is an early writer in the space. There's a PhD guy named Dennis Jaffe. He's written about this. And we can tell you, Chris, your family can succeed for the next 100 years. Your family, not just a business. But what it boils down to is you have to acknowledge this is my responsibility, and you have to teach vision, mission, values. That's the core of what you do. The vision being, what's the long term? What's our hope for our family for the next 150 years? And so we help families craft that. By the way, you understand this because you're a marketing guy, 5 to 7 words. Our family's vision statement for my wife and I is disciples everywhere for generations. 4 words. Pretty simple. And so you get a vision statement, and then you got to have a mission statement. What do we do every day? What's the thing that we're going to try to live out every day? And so we see people come up with very simple ones, whether it's to love God, love people, serve the world. That's a common one sometimes that we'll see. But simple mission statements, here's what we do every single day. And then you got to have your values. 3 to 5 words that define the values, that provide the guardrails, because values are protective and they're attractive at the same time. And then the hard work really begins, which is you have to repeat. In the Jewish world, they still practice Sabbath. If you go to Israel, they practice Sabbath, and here it is in their timeline, a couple thousand years later, still practicing Sabbath. And what they would tell you is that by the 101st time of repetition, you might have it down.
Wow. So you're bringing in these extra new generations into this vision, mission, values. Do they change as it gets handed off from generation to generation? Do they stay the same? What does that process look like to bring a new generation?
So there's, if you will, the big tent and then the small tent. So the big tent is you have everybody subscribe to, here's the big family vision, mission, values. But like, for instance, if you step into a family, you and your wife may have some tweaks on the values, and you're going to subscribe to certain things that we agree to generationally at the big family level when I participate in the big tent, but then at your individual family, it does allow for freedom within the form. So practically speaking, for instance, the reason why you want to have agreement at the big tent, if there's a family-owned business, you got to agree about how do we keep this business going. One of the great dangers in so many of the family-owned businesses, they keep splitting up stock. And you have people who work in the company and those who don't. Well, the people who don't work in the company have a very different interest for when they should get their money. So those are agreements that you have to make. And then likewise, frankly, one of the places where we see lots of disagreement is around family giving. Where do you give your money to? Because it tends to change over time. But if we find if the founders articulate what that is, the following generations are likely to say, we agree with that.
So you've seen so much go good and bad. You've seen a lot of good, even though there is a lot of bad. You've seen a lot of good in the process. And you started writing and co-writing some books to talk about this. Talk about how you got into book writing. Talk about what you have going on recently and what you're doing coming up in the future.
Yeah, so we're pretty excited. We've created, so our ministry is called Legacy Stone, and that's where we've created content for families, every family. You don't have to be a billionaire to use our content. And so we have a curriculum. It's a small group curriculum, 7-week curriculum, and families walk out of that with their vision, mission, values, and frankly, some giving guidelines. Our next curriculum is built around family conflict. I brought that one with me. So the family conflict blueprint, and that's really built around this idea that if you're a family, you're going to have conflict, and you need a process on how you deal with it. And if you have a common process, you're more likely to handle it successfully. But we always recognize from the beginning that if you are going to have a message, that at some point in time you need to write it down and be able to have a simple way to communicate it so others could do the same. So that's been the journey we've been on. We've written a few books. Of course, I've written a few books now with David Green, the founder of Hobby Lobby. He's been a great leader. We host leadership events, and we bring in people from all around the country. And of course, people would scramble furiously writing notes, and people would say, oh, I've got all these pages of notes. Just met a guy, and he'd come to an event like 9 years ago, and he still had all of his notes. He says, one of the great days in my life. And that's when we said, boy, we've got to write a book. We've got to actually take and write this stuff down so others can grab a hold of it. We've had some great stories of people who picked up a book, and literally people sometimes will come up to me. Even just recently, I had somebody's like, "I've seen you. I've seen your picture," but the profound change in the lives of people sometimes that we've never. We were talking about planet shakers, and I was in Australia about a year ago, and from the stage, there's a guy preaching, and he starts talking about the first book that we did with David Green called Giving It All Away. And he's talking about how one of the guys in his congregation sold a business, one of his top businesses for like $100 million to give it away. And I had no idea. Those are the kind of stories, though, that we've seen.
Those are amazing stories. And one of the things that I really like that you've done, because obviously for many years, more than multiple decades, you've been dealing with high net worth families and helping them do that. But really with some of the stuff you're doing with Legacy Stone, you've also turned that into this is for anybody, right? And it's the goal is help families get better and therefore be able to make ripple effects in generations and make change regardless of where they're at.
If you're going to be have a business, you're going to have a church, you're going to have a nonprofit organization, the first key to success is not the numbers on the bottom line, it's the healthy families that you serve. And so I recognize with some of the high net worth families that I was working with, that's great. But in many cases, some of those families call me really late. And there's some messy stuff that I've had to deal with over the years. Not fun. And so I recognize that we needed to start earlier. We needed to start with the families that were pre-married, thinking about it, or married with a few kids. And that's been our greatest success. I mean, when we first piloted some of the small group curriculum, we had a young couple. They actually weren't engaged yet. They got engaged during the course of the study. And then later they got married. But they will tell you that one of the most profound things for them is on the wall of their home is their vision, mission, values, and code of conduct. So sometimes they argue and they'll say, hey, how are you living out our value of generosity? And it's making a difference on how they live. So that's our goal. Global families, how do we help families thrive for generations to come? Changes the community, the company, the churches, the organizations, makes the world better.
So we talk a lot about leadership on the podcast and a lot about servant leadership specifically. When you hear servant leadership and think about it in your world, how do you see it play out and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, so we wrote a book with David Green too called Leadership Not by the Book. And there's a great premise coming out of that book, because here's David Green, a guy that starts a business with $600, and his kids and his wife are working to make the business work. And today that business will probably eclipse $8 billion in sales, 50,000 employees. And they give away half of their profit. The business seems to work when the Harvard guys would say what they're doing doesn't make sense. I mean, how many retail businesses are closed on Sunday, close at 8, and give away half of their profit and still survive? But ultimately, one of the things that you see, getting to your point about servant leadership, is David Green talks about the idea that I hire great people to do their jobs. So he defers to them. He doesn't just delegate. Sometimes they're walking in with, hey, I got this idea, or I'm thinking about this. And he's like, hey, you're the one. Go do that. Make that happen. In the greatest moment, I don't know if you'd call it the greatest moment, but one of the most difficult moments is, their company went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court to argue a case that could determine the outcome of the company. And the general counsel came to David Green and said, hey, I think we need to hire this lawyer to argue that Supreme Court case. Kind of a major decision, right? And David's response was, you're the guy. It's your decision. Wow. That's servant leadership. It's not just the idea that you delegate, but that you defer. When you give somebody authority, you let them operate under that authority.
Wow. That is extremely powerful. I mean, when you think through that kind of level of empowerment, it probably makes the organizations thrive significantly better. But at the same time, it also sounds like you're losing control. How do you help empower people and help an organization thrive, and then also not lose control and direction of where you really want it to go?
Yeah, the general counsel, by the way, of Hobby Lobby is the guy that came to, when we did that book, we actually interviewed all the top level leaders. And we'd always ask them the same question, which is, what's the secret sauce? Why does this thing work when it shouldn't? I mean, it really doesn't make sense how they run some of their business. You know, they have one distribution center, as a for instance. They have no POS at the register. They just do things that don't seem to make sense. But ultimately, the other point that where you're going to is, okay, so how can you defer and give authority to, but still know that you're paying attention? And David Green, again, talks about this idea is that they actually, he wants to understand the big picture, but he also wants to be in the weeds enough. Yeah. Now, that seems counterculture because usually as we rise in leadership, it's like, hey, you got to stay at the 30,000 foot. David wants to know, how much are we selling pony beads for? Yeah. He's enough in the weeds to pay attention. And for him, it's, I need to know what am I best gifted at and keep the main thing the main thing. And I think that's really wise. So oftentimes we started a business because we're a great technician. We understand something really well. But then as the business grows, we move too far away from that. And so we lose actually some of that ability to serve really well because we don't understand the heartbeat.
Yeah. Well, in some families and some businesses, they're bringing in other generations like we talked about. Often that gets sticky when you bring in other generations, and it doesn't have to be with Hobby Lobby. It can be just general from what you've seen with a lot of organizations. Where do people go wrong when they bring in family into business? And then where do they go right?
The number one thing that we see for families trying to bring in, whether it be their kids or grandkids or in-laws, is you've got to actually prepare them well. So the research says what is that it's usually the failure is family communication, but the next big failure is how well did you prepare the next generation. So we always recommend the idea of a family employment committee, even if you're a nonprofit. By the way, is if you're going to bring those kids in, create a family employment committee and have on that committee people that, whether it's HR, legal, people who know the family well. Maybe, yes, you'll have a family member on there, but actually give that kid a sounding board to be able to say, what am I doing right? Where do I need to improve? Where do I need to grow? Are there education classes? How do I compensate you? And what it does is it'll take away the founder or that kind of father, mother, patriarch, matriarch kind of syndrome where you feel like your livelihood is dependent upon them solely. We usually see the parents either underpay or overpay. And that's where that family employment committee can be really, really helpful about setting compensation, but also providing that window of feedback to say, hey, Chris, you know, you're really not cutting it here. Or, Chris, you're doing a great job. Let's go see if we can't get you paid more. And then here's what steps look like for you to be a leader inside that company. Or, Chris, you know what? You're probably going to be really well suited to not be here. A lot easier for a committee to make that statement than a mom or dad.
Yeah. Wow, that's so good. As people listening are thinking about how they get involved in different businesses, there's so many good takeaways. If people who are listening aren't necessarily thinking about philanthropy at any giving level, just because they need the money, they need to keep it's their money they worked hard for, and they need to keep it. How do you help people start flexing the generosity muscle if it's almost non-existent?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is if you want to be successful as a business and as a family, the best practices are you'll have vision, mission, values, you'll have a code of conduct, and you're going to be generous. So one of the oldest family-owned businesses around the world was a construction company in Japan. They made it like 44 generations before they finally had to sell to private equity. Well, part of their mindset was this generosity kind of mindset. Another family, of course, sometimes they get a bad rap, is the Rothschild family. They're a Jewish family, but because they came from those Jewish roots, there was always the mindset that we're tithers. We're going to give 10% of our income into the community. And just if you recognize that if you don't have some kind of outward expression of who you are as a family, then you're going to become internalized. And frankly, it's that internalization that's going to kill you. So stop it. Get out there and be generous.
You get to go around the world and speak. on a lot of different topics. When you're going into different groups and you're speaking to these large crowds of people, it's probably a different conversation than when you're sitting in a boardroom and helping consult or advise, or even one-on-one. When you think through the key things for a large audience, for just like a company audience, and for a one-on-one conversation, where do you tend to start with those people? Because I know a lot of it starts with listening, but where does it start in terms of where you think the conversations will go?
So it's, by the way, the size of audience actually doesn't really matter, or whether it's boardroom or one-on-one. Ultimately, what it really comes down to is what question. I typically say, what's your framing question? How do you want to frame up the conversation? So if I'm speaking to 1,000 people, or I'm speaking to you, it's like, hey, Chris, what's on your heart? What's going on? And even in many cases, I'll start out a talk by saying, man, I'd just like to talk to you guys. So tell me what's going on in your lives. And I want to ask questions. So that's really the key, is to start with questions. Yeah. And those questions frame up where you should be going in that conversation. So the scriptures tell us that the purpose in a man's mind is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. Yeah. And so if you ask those good questions, you'll eventually find out the purpose of a person's heart. And then from that, you can provide direction to where that need is.
Wow, that is so good. How much of that comes out in the new book? You know, how in the new book, what all do you get into that you think these are the biggest takeaways that people will need to get from that book?
Yeah, the book coming out in October 14th is actually the launch date, although people can go pre-order now. Yeah. It's called The Legacy Life, Leading Your Family to Make a Difference for Eternity. There's a 90-day devotional study guide that you can order with the book as well. But ultimately, the book is really a reset or a reframe. And it asks, so I told you we start with questions. What's the purpose of family? Why do we do this thing? What's the big deal here? And then frankly, why should we be more intentional about our family than we are today? And so it gets at what I call the eternal ache. Every single one of us wants to live a life of purpose and meaning. We want something that we're built for, something that drives to significance. But our problem is we have a lot of short-term thinking. And that short-term thinking leads us to a place that, boom, all of a sudden it's like, raise those kids and they're graduated from high school and they're into college and they're off doing their own careers, and we don't know how to put the toothpaste back in the tube. And so it really tries to drive towards, let's reframe this idea of family to something that's a generational kind of mindset. We really can operate and think as a team. And then what are the practices by which we get there?
I know a little bit of your backstory, more from just what I've seen online and read about and heard you talk about, but you had a really unique family upbringing that it's interesting to see how that has shaped you, and then also how important family has become on the flip side. How do you think your early childhood years have affected kind of how you're helping families now think through this in their family?
Yeah, every family comes from a story. I'm not an island. I can't divorce where I came from. But I think the adage really drives around the idea is that your family past informs you, but it doesn't give you your identity. It's not what's going to give you your ultimate purpose. Only God can give you your identity and your purpose, but your past can inform you. And so in my case, I grew up very poor. And one of the things, by the way, that we'll tell families to do is go back and understand your family genealogy. Again, if you go into that collective kind of mindset, family history is extremely important because it tells us where you came from, what your family did, the influences geographically that would shape you. All those things play a factor in who you are today. So my family story influences how I think about the world, the the poverty kind of mindset, the humility that comes from living in that kind of environment, I think actually helps give me a broader appreciation for the family members across the board, and frankly, some of the pain that they might be experiencing. And it gives me a great heart for the idea of family unity. So even in the midst of some of my very rough growing up years, my brothers and sisters, we had to band together. Life was tough, and so we had to go work in the garden together and do chores together because we needed to. We needed to make it work. So I experienced both some of the pain of this hyper-individualistic world coupled with the power of a collective family working together.
It's so interesting because earlier you talk about that families don't go in with this 100-year mindset. And in some of what you're talking about and what you produce, people might think, oh, I'm just going to do this and then it's all good. And what you've seen is it takes tons of hard work and tons of repetition and tons of engagement, very intentional engagement. But as people are thinking through, most of them are living very short-minded. You know, we're thinking about what's going on next week. How do I make sure next year I'm set up well? How do I make sure I retire okay? I've never heard people talk about this 100-year mindset, you know, and how they keep thinking about it. How do you help people shift from that short-term thinking to really long-term and eternal thinking? Yeah,
the book, we talk about what is the definition of legacy. And that's, again, something that we're trying to reshape, because the problem for most people is it's what you just described. It's that I'm working towards retirement, you know, and I'm making enough so I can go sit on a beach somewhere. Retirement's a pretty new concept. You know, it used to be that people had to work their whole lives, and it wasn't really until really the last 50 years or so that some of this prosperity mindset has come into being. But the idea of where should we be on some of this longer term thinking, it's the idea that, man, legacy is what you set in motion. It's not what you leave behind. I've had guys that if I come in and say, hey, we need to talk about your will or trust, are like, what do I care? My kids will figure it out. If it's trouble for them, I'm gone. And that's lazy. Yeah. But this idea of actually pulling the family together and saying, hey, the Lessner family or the High family, we're part of something great, and we're setting in motion something really powerful that someday in heaven we're going to get to see the results of that work. And that's the long tomorrow. Do you want to live for what David Green calls the vapor life, or do you want to live for the eternal life?
I love that. I've never thought of legacy as something that it's all about what you set in motion. Is there quantity to that in terms of, can you be setting too many things in motion, or is part of then leaving a lasting legacy setting as many things in motion as you feel you can?
The idea of what you're setting in motion, simplify it, and you just drill down to the idea of vision, mission, values. Because even you here with the businesses that you operate, you know, they represent multiple things, but at the same time, they represent a core of who you are. What do you care about? What do you value? That's what you're trying to set in motion. And at the end of the day, you know, I come from faith, of course, and so God's word, man's soul. It's that day that who are the relationships that I've invested in that will make an eternal difference?
Wow. This is such powerful stuff. Bill, I want to finish with 10 rapid fire questions where I'm just going to throw things at you and you say the first thing that comes to mind.
Fire away.
Who's the first person you think of when I say servant leadership?
First person, I would say David Green.
5 words that most describe you.
5 words: God's word, generosity, adventure, story, and restoration. That's our 5 family values.
So that makes it easy. Yeah. So for future guests, we have to think through, hey, do you have your family values? Maybe that's what we change it to.
Yeah.
All right. Favorite book or movie?
Favorite book or movie? Of course, favorite movie that I love. I'm going to do both, okay?
Yeah.
So favorite movie, Field of Dreams.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Love that last scene, father, son. And favorite book is Don't Waste Your Life by John Piper.
Wow. That's a good one. Favorite food?
Favorite food? My mom was always a great cook of fried chicken.
Wow. All right. Favorite thing to do in your free time?
Favorite thing to do? Man, I love to read and to write. Journal. I've been journaling for 50 years.
Wow. Pause on the 10 questions because I need to hear more about that. What have you found are the benefits from journaling?
Journaling is like cheap therapy. It is really a way for you to process what's going on in your world, have reflections. And the benefit of long-term journaling is there are things sometimes that you struggle with for decades. I mean, literally. There's a story in the scriptures I didn't understand for 20 years. And finally, in the 20th year, it's like, oh, that's what it is. So the wrestling is really good in journaling.
That's good. All right. Surprising fact about you.
Surprising fact about me. I've actually written quite a bit of poetry.
All right. Favorite place you've been?
Favorite place, Switzerland.
Wow. Place you want to go that you have not been?
Iceland.
All right. Best advice you've ever received?
Keep a humble posture. And that is literally posture. It's, when we get proud, we tend to rise up. But sometimes you need to lower yourself. Philippians 2.
That is so good. Well, for everyone listening, we're going to throw a bunch of information in the description, places they can go check out your content. What would you say is one action step out of this that you hope people take and how they can best engage some of the stuff you're doing on the family side?
2 action steps.
Yeah.
Go buy the book, The Legacy Life. You can pre-order it now, or I don't know when this will release, but they can get it at release time because it will change the way you think. But go to Legacy Stone website and check out some of the content so you can live intentionally with your family.
Wow. This is so good. Thank you, Bill, for your willingness to be on the podcast. This is such a treat.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Servant Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss an update. Be sure to check out the servantleadershippodcast.org for more updates and additional bonus content.